Hello, void and all who inhabit it. It's me, and I don't have a half-baked thesis for today. I just saw some patterns and wanted to talk about them. This content creator I really enjoy, Kenny, has this series called Bad Movies in a Beat. It's really funny. It'll be linked down below. And because of the series, she's often asking for terrible movie recommendations on Twitter. It was through her ask that I learned of Passion Flicks. They're not paying me, so I'm not going to give a rundown of everything they offer, but essentially, it's a streaming service for movies based on romance novels. Interest piqued. I browsed through their catalog and discovered a promotion for a recent Passion Flicks original, Gabriel's Inferno, which got bonus points in my book for also being an entire film trilogy. I knew nothing about this series or the author, Sylvain Reynard, before watching the film, but after the first one, I had questions about the characters' ages, so I googled the book and discovered that it started as Twilight fanfiction. Hi, I didn't put this in the script, but I'm going to be popping in a lot. First of all, editing me, hello. But this bugged the hell out of me, and this is what I looked up, and I feel like it needs a whole moment of itself for me to just rant. Julia and Gabriel are 10 years apart in age, okay? When we meet Julia, she's 23, meaning that Gabriel is 33. I think that's a bit vast, but whatever. They're both grown. However, as the story progresses, we learn that Julia met Gabriel when she was 17, meaning he was 27, okay? As someone who is turning 27 this year, that's fucking gross. But whatever. I guess it's cute. But there's this thing that keeps happening throughout the whole flashback sequence. Maybe I'll insert a clip here, girl. I don't know. You can find this for free. Oop, too much. There's this thing that keeps happening in the flashback where Gabriel will ask Julia, have you ever done this thing with a boy before? Have you ever held a boy's hand before? Have you ever kissed a boy before? Have you ever laid in the grass and looked at the stars with a boy before? And every time Julia says no, and Gabriel says, well, I'm glad to be your first. He is 27. Talking to us. It's so gross. And there is a part before we get the flashback scene where where they're at a club. They're at a club. She's in a skater dress. Anyway, they're dancing. And Gabriel says, have you ever danced like this? I don't remember if he said with a man or with a boy before. Regardless, Julia's answer is no. And he says, well, I'm glad to be your first. And it triggers Julia. She gets really upset because she knows the memory, but Gabriel doesn't at that point. And she runs off and he's like, I don't understand what's going on. And we're supposed to just see it as Julia being upset that Gabriel doesn't remember this thing that's really important to her. But I'm like, you a victim. So of course now I'm watching the rest of the films with this comparison in mind, and 50 Shades as well. I know all the horny on main stories get compared to 50 Shades, but this is different. Before that, though, what are these series? For ease, I will be referring to each series by the title of its first film only. Gabriel's Inferno is an erotic romance about Julia Mitchell, a graduate student at the University of Toronto, and her torrid love affair with her professor, who also happens to be her best friend's older brother, Gabriel Emerson. Over the course of the story, we learn that they had actually met years ago, and Julia has been waiting to reunite ever since, but Gabriel doesn't remember her. Their relationship starts off rocky, but by the 30-minute point of the second film, they're basically ready to live forever together. 50 Shades of Grey is an erotic romance series about Anastasia, or Anna Steele, a college senior at Washington State University, and her torrid love affair with big-time businessman and BDSM aficionado Christian Grey. Twilight is a vampire-themed fantasy romance series about Bella Swan, a high school senior living in Forks, Washington, and her torrid love affair with 104-year-old vampire Edward Cullen. Across the three, we have large power dynamics, a brooding love interest, and wealth. okay? All these men are richer than God, and that is important. At first, I was only looking for the Twilight references in Gabriel's Inferno, because the only similarities I saw between Gabriel's Inferno and 50 Shades of Grey, other than the fact that they both started as fan fiction, was that our Bella stand-in was a mousy, virginal university student, and our Edward stand-in was a rich, emotionally stunted asshole. But there's this scene in the second Gabriel's Inferno movie where our Jacob stand-in tells Julia, our grad school Bella, hey, you see that woman sat next to Gabriel who's very obviously stroking him off in a public place? Yeah, they had an affair. Yeah, girl. And she's into S&M. I don't know about the B or the D, but the S and the M, that's her jam. After looking up when Rihanna released Loud to confirm my suspicions, I started paying more attention to the fanfic specific tropes that were occurring in the story. Gabriel's Inferno and 50 Shades of Grey obviously have some portions that are just remeshed versions of Twilight's plot, but what's really interesting are the similarities they have to each other. Of all the ways this story could be retold, they chose a lot of the same parts. And that's not to say that one story ripped off of the other. In fact, the first book from both series was published in the same year, and if anything, Gabriel's Inferno came out first, but rather to point to what was popular and really getting the fandom going a decade ago. Well, not all the fandom. 50 Shades of Grey and Gabriel's Inferno are specifically a window into what happened to the foundational aspects of Twilight's plot once it was consumed by and filtered through older viewers. These people weren't in their early 20s writing fan fiction. In 2011, when the first Gabriel's Inferno and 50 Shades of Grey novels were released, the authors were 61 and 48 respectively. A major reason 50 Shades of Grey got the reputation as being for hot and bothered suburban moms, despite the fact that neither main character is over 30 years old, was because of the author's age. To dive into what makes this story so interesting for adults and why it is a formula that continues to be reproduced, we first have to go back to the phenomenon of Twilight moms. With the release of the first film in 2008, the World Wide Web saw the birth of a new internet community. Moms across the country were convening on Facebook and on forums and a whole website that is still functional to this day to talk about their love of Twilight. But what pulled so many moms to the series, especially when at the same time there were just as many, if not more, parents trying to get rid of Harry Potter? I know, read a different book. But I bring up Harry Potter not just because it was the other popular, super popular young adult series at the time, but because as soon as that book came out, people were trying to get that bitch out of here. And that's not to say that Twilight didn't get any backlash. Sarah Z recently did a video on the history of Twilight and goes over that more in depth. But adults weren't filing an obscene amount of requests to have the book banned until the films came out. And again, at this same time, we see a rise in the number of moms getting interested in the story, which makes sense if you're the type of mom who wants to know what your kids are watching, so you go watch it with them. But there are plenty of Twilight moms who didn't have kids old enough to watch the films when they came out, if they had kids at all. Also, I keep saying moms, but I want to point out that the author of Gabriel's Inferno is a man. He keeps anonymous. The name he writes under is a pseudonym and nobody knows who he is, but we do know he's a 70-year-old man. So yes, mom groups were the loudest. So while mom groups were the largest and the loudest, it's clear that adults from all different walks of life were interested in the series. There's also the wide sweeping term fandom moms, which just refers to older fans in general. However, if we look at articles quoting Twilight moms, whether they have kids or not, self-proclaimed Twilight moms, we can see a lot of what gets ported over into the fan fiction and by extension 50 Shades of Grey and Gabriel's Inferno. Of the different comments, articles, quotes that I read, the top 4 themes that popped up were viewing Bella as a caretaker or seeing her as having maternal traits, the essence of innocence, which I will break down even further, chastity or no premarital sex specifically, and an admiration of the plain and ordinary. So starting with Bella as a caretaker, I think Bella spends more time being taken care of than taking care of others, but sure, that's there, especially closer to the end of the series once we have the demon puppet baby. But more than that, Bella is ready and willing to fall into the darkness with Edward. When you consider the potential religious messaging behind Meyer's depiction of vampires, Bella wanting to join Edward isn't necessarily a bad thing. Sure, you're at risk of going on a murderous rage, but not if you stick to a strict diet. Bella is willing to give up so much to have Edward in her life. He is the center of her care for the bulk of the whole series. Remove the magical aspect of what makes Edward dangerous, and you just have a man with inner turmoil. As a result, in both 50 Shades and Gabriel's Inferno, the Bella character is focused on pulling Edward out of the darkness. She is determined to be the reason why he's able to do and be better. It's easier to read caretaker energy in this set of behavior, but it is worth noting that all of it is directed towards the love interest. Not to be all Freudian, but it isn't lost on me that Christian and Gabriel have lost their mothers specifically, while Edward never really talks about his family from before he turned. The female character feeling the need to take care of the male character further amplifies a reason why he needs to be emotionally stunted.
Okay, he's not going to have been alive for 100 years, so what can we use to signal that he's been left broken and damaged, waiting to be pieced together by this mousy waif woman?
Emotional abuse and child neglect.
Through this, these stories are reproducing the idea of women as the emotional lightning rod for stunted men. While Twilight may be teaching that to teens, Gabriel's Inferno and 50 Shades of Grey are operating off of the idea that you already buy into that. Going even further and branching into our next theme, this behavior also compounds the idea of a special kind of love and care that can only be provided by the innocence of a virgin. The hope and the fantasy inherent in being a blank slate of sorts that older readers enjoyed from Twilight is very prevalent and continues in both of these stories. In Gabriel's Inferno and 50 Shades of Grey, the idea of youth and innocence is mostly created by a lack of experience and a noticeable age gap. Innocence is also built up via having a love interest who tends after the main character. I'm separating the idea of being taken care of from chivalry as the actual physical care, but both of these ideas, being taken care of and having a chivalrous man, popped up in positive comments about Twilight and seem to all mesh together in this greater idea of innocence. For being taken care of, the very literal manifestation in the fanfic versions pop up in Anna and Julia being virgins who can't drive. These women have key parts of their plot driven, no pun intended, by the fact that they can't drive. Christian buys Anna a car, Gabriel offers Julia a ride in this really long wet t-shirt scene, and we later only see her in his car. These women are only able to access a new level of mobility literally because of the financial and material support provided by this man. On the flip side, Bella has that rinky-dink truck, so although we see her in Edward's Volvo often, she's not dependent on him to get around. Also, I want to note that a lot of the financial support given to these women is without asking them first. Christian buys Anna a car, and later the company that she works at, without hesitation, without conversation, he just does it. While Gabriel awards Julia grant money to help with her tuition, like 10 seconds after he learns that that's something that she's struggling with. Again, without talking about it. And as with a lot of things these men do, these acts are supposed to be seen as romantic, as protective, when in reality they often function to remove the option for any other choice from the main character. Each protagonist ends up rejecting the financial support her love interest throws at her, but both the fact that it is offered, given, yeah, it wasn't offered, girl. There was no choice. Here's some money. And the fact that the main character eventually accepts it is a step away from Twilight. Gabriel's Inferno and 50 Shades of Grey take it a step further when we look at how they handle chivalry. A lot of older readers of Twilight spoke to appreciating Edward's chivalry and the way he cared for Bella. Again, separating this from the let me pay your tuition, let me buy you a car, let me fly you around on my private helicopter type of material care, chivalry leaves us with the intangible behaviors that this man has, the code of conduct that he carries himself with. Why does this fall under innocence? Because of the way the adult versions of these stories explore power dynamics. When people say chivalry is dead, it's not always the small acts of kindness that they are referring to, but the power dynamics between men and women, often with a negative view of women who act more independently. There is an air of let the men take charge, which lends itself to asking women to be easier, more malleable, and passive in a way that I think is often connected with how we describe people as being more innocent or worth protecting or delicate. 50 Shades of Grey is a bit literal when it comes to the power play, but both Christian and Gabriel are domineering. There are multiple parts in the plot where they see their love interest talking to another man and they get visibly upset to the point at which they try to control who she can and can't talk to. And we are supposed to see that as romantic. Ooh, he's protecting your virtue. No, he has boundary issues. Going with the erotic aspect of these stories, both Julia and Anna have moments where they say, I'm not here to just be fucked, stuffed, rode hard, and put away wet. I'm the type of woman you care for. From both sides of the relationship, viewers are being told that this woman is on the Madonna side of the complex. And if you, big brooding man, want snoo-snoo, you're gonna have to come correct. And that means treating her differently. From this, we also get the next theme of chastity. Some fans specifically pointed to an appreciation of no premarital sex, but the idea, regardless of how they felt about that, is the importance of waiting. Now, Bella and Edward don't have sex until they're married, but Bella, Miss Isabella Marie Swan, she was fiending for that big undead dick. It's my cherry and I want it popped now, head ass. It was really funny for me to read of older readers pulling enjoyment from the fact that sex wasn't centered in the relationship when it was. The yearning, the longing, the weight, that was centered in the relationship. In fact, there's an article from the Daily Mail in which an older fan of Twilight describes the series as a bubbling journey of anticipation and sexual desire. The literary edging really gets the people going. 50 Shades of Grey and Gabriel's Inferno definitely capitalizing off of drawing out sexual relief, whether it's film by film or the whole series long. On top of that, in the beginning of both stories, we see the protagonists hold off sex for different lengths of time as a means of wielding power. The stories are able to bank on the audience's need to nut and send the messaging of, see ladies, being chaste is powerful. The f***ing versus making love dynamic is also important when considering the value placed on sex in these stories. Notably, in the 50 Shades trilogy, Christian going back to BDSM is always seen as a slip in his progress or a marker of the dark, horrible past he needs to leave in favor of vanilla missionary on Tuesdays at 9 p.m. only type of sex. He and Anna may spice it up a little bit, but for him to return to the Red Room version of doing things or just a harder type of sex would ruin their relationship. And the story makes it clear that that end wouldn't be because of an incompatibility between the two of them, but because that behavior would signal that Christian is truly depraved and incapable of being saved. The brief S&M mention in the Gabriel's Inferno film that sparked this whole video occurs in a scene where Julia says, if you tell me that you are into that kinky shit, I am out of here. And Gabriel has to reassure her that no, I don't do that. That was just something that happened when I was at a super low point in my life. Gabriel and Christian's sexual histories also bring us to our last major theme, which is an admiration for the plain and ordinary. I mentioned before that Gabriel and Christian are much more emotionally wounded than Edward, but they also fall much more closer to the historical romance trope of being a rake, being a lascivious, lustful rich man who's used to getting what he wants and fucking who he pleases, until he meets this meek, silent, calming woman. editing me here, popping in to say that these men being hot, rich, and wounded is not unique. That is very much a prototype of the romance novel formula. However, romance novel heroines typically have a bit more bite. Daphne from Bridgerton is a great example. In the book, she is a hot mess, being a spinster who talks back. Bella and her descendants are specifically bland in a way that is different from how we usually see in romance novels. And this is the crown jewel at the center of Twilight, of 50 Shades of Grey, of Gabriel's Inferno, of 360, well, no, because Laura had an actual personality. But the key to the Krabby Patty formula is a nondescript, mousy brunette woman with a soft voice and next to non-existent sexual history for the viewer to layer themselves on top of. That's the M next to the X plus B, and it will hit every single time, to the point at which an anonymous unknown writer could get a 6-figure book deal simply because his series fit into the formula. The thing is, the majority of people are plain and ordinary. That's why the MCU version of Spider-Man has been so upsetting to some people, because we went from having a friendly neighborhood protector to Tony Stark's protege with a high-powered suit. Even in our superheroes, we want characters who are simple and down to earth. So you take a modest character and you give her an extraordinary love story, which appeals to so many people who feel like they don't often see this type of story given to this type of character, and you have it occur at the same time in which the media circuit is intent on belittling and mocking the people who do enjoy that story, and boom, you have a phenomenon. Quiet as it's kept, the mockery of Twilight really boosted its popularity. Recently, more people have been looking back and realizing, oh, y'all just hated Twilight because teen girls liked it. But even at the time, fans of Twilight and later 50 Shades of Grey were bolstered by their love of the series and the communities that they found within that love, that they couldn't be swayed, to the point at which other people were like, damn, is it really that good? Maybe I should check this out. There are several issues with Twilight, both the books and the movies, but the interest it sparked in teen girls and adult women is not one of those issues. A lot of fans resonated with Bella because she was so average, and as a result, they are super protective both of the character and the story as an outlet for their own fantasies. Also, this is shifting away from the films, but I get the impression that a lot of people would benefit from reading romance novels. I know there's still shame around that, like folks are like, I don't want to be the sketchy lady reading Daniel Steele at the beach, but I think part of what makes a series like Twilight or 50 Shades of Grey or even Gabriel's Inferno so popular is that it allows readers, fans, interested parties to have the excuse of, well, I'm just looking at this because it's popular right now. A lot of what these readers were looking for, which is a couple hundred pages of sexual tension between a plain Jane and a rough millionaire, can be found quite easily in the romance novel section of your local public library. But if you feel ashamed to be seen there and you limit yourself in the books that you allow yourself to read, you're a bit more dependent on whatever pops up in the mainstream in order to get your fix. We gotta let that go. Okay, we're letting go of shame all 2021. But there you have it, the major pieces to the Twilight-inspired puzzle of romance writing. A main character who's perceived as a caretaker, the essence of innocence, mostly via markers of inexperience and having less power, sexual tension, and an admiration of the main plain Jane. All this being said, I'm really interested to see what happens with To All the Boys I Loved Before, because we have a very similar setup of a regular girl having a whirlwind love story. Are there 40-year-olds out there writing AU fanfic that will be turned into an independent book series and whole film trilogy 10 years from now? I kind of hope not. Not because I don't like To All the Boys I Loved Before, but because formulaic storytelling is boring. Look at the difference between the first To All the Boys movie and the second one, or even Twilight and New Moon. The first Twilight movie was shot with a MacBook photo booth filter over the entire thing, a bumpin' ass soundtrack, and excessively dramatic shots. That indie touch, that campy dedication to the text, was lost when the budget went up and the director was swapped out in favor of something a bit more Hollywood cookie cutter. Take a step further to 50 Shades of Grey and Gabriel's Inferno, and you can see how taking care with the story erodes in favor of keeping to the formula. Formulaic storytelling also erases a major appeal of fan fiction. If you're reading fan fiction, it's probably because it's 1 a.m. and you're procrastinating and you really love the characters and you want to see more of them, even if it's an alternate universe version of their story. When you whittle Twilight down to just the outlines of the main characters and their relationship, a lot of times the actual appeal, the idea of a character you can get invested in, gets lost. 365 Days is actually a great example of this. Neither the book nor the movie started as Twilight fanfiction, but that series is definitely trying to capitalize off of some major parts of the formula, albeit with little to no consideration of making a cohesive plot or likable characters. Out of this whole list, I think Laura is the most chaotically interesting, but her whole story is a mess in a way that is very much unlike the rest of the women that we're looking at, and that's not a good thing in this case. However, 365 Days hits the minor falls and major lifts, so even if it's the 4th or 5th iteration of this dynamic, it's a story you're expected to recognize and be enthralled by. Gabriel's Inferno and 50 Shades of Grey are stories that reflect tropes that were popular at the time, and at least in 50 Shades' case, garnered widespread support in return. Less formula and more Mad Libs approach. More importantly, the authors of these series understood how to write new characters within a familiar mold in a way that would be captivating to older audiences. They were able to give their flawed heartthrobs a dramatic enough backstory and make their milquetoast main characters spunky enough to stick out. But girl, we have worn this formula out. We don't need no more. And if you are pressed to disagree with me, I implore you to go to your local library. Walk to the back, okay? You'll see a stack that'll be waist high, depending on how tall you are, full of paperbacks, okay? The binding, the label on the binding will be a red sticker with an initial instead of the usual Dewey Decimal structure or whatever system your library uses. Alternatively, you can do this on your library's online catalog if you cannot physically go in. Anyway, close your eyes, make a wish, and pick a book. You'll likely land on one of 4 options: a contemporary romance, potentially with a baby on the cover, giving you very much Hallmark; a historical romance set in England, anytime between the beginning of the Georgian era and the end of the Victorian period; a supernatural romance, very likely vampires, but there's also a lot of demon shit out there, girl, I'm not gonna lie; or cowboys. But regardless of genre, I promise you 9 times out of 10, unless you landed on a Kimani romance, if your library even has those, you will have found a story about a high-powered, chiseled specimen of a man falling in love with some basic white lady whose path randomly crossed into his. It's out there. It's been out there, and you probably had a better chance of finding it in 2008. Twilight came to popularity at the resurgence of young adult romance literature. The series and other YA series that came out in the early 2000s provided content both to teens who didn't have any and to adults who, for one reason or another, weren't already consuming the readily available content in the adult romance genre. As such, Twilight's inflated popularity has allowed recreations of that story and recreations of the recreation to thrive. But Twilight was filling a need that no longer exists the same way. Rehashing the same story will always get some type of attention because of the notoriety of Twilight and because of the simplicity of the formula, but there are so many other narratives to focus on. We can put this welcome wagon fruitcake of a story to rest. It's time. If you made it to the end, thank you for making it to the end. Editing me and my pimple back again to say thank you to my friend Jackie of studiojafe. If you didn't notice, I have a new profile picture and she created it. I will link her Instagram down below. If you like cute kawaii type of art, lots of times with motivational messages, you should definitely check out her work. Have you read any of these books? I have the feeling that there's a higher chance you've seen the movies, but I like to know about the differences, obviously, between the different mediums. Specifically, I want to know if the pacing in Gabriel's Inferno is that bad in the books or not. I have the feeling that bad pacing is a hallmark of passion flicks films in general, but it's helpful to know, to contrast, to see. Anyway, until next time, stay safe. I'll catch you in the next echo chamber.